All Monica wanted was a fair hearing for her son. Instead, she was shoved, insulted, and humiliated by a white cop who had no clue she was the CIA director's wife. What would you do if the system tried to bury you not knowing you came with a shovel? If that made your heart skip hit like and follow along? This is where her quiet revenge began. That morning, the courthouse didn't feel like a place for truth. It felt like a stage, and the show had already started before Monica Fields and her 13-year-old son even stepped through the doors. People in the hallway weren't whispering out of curiosity. They were whispering because they believed they already knew everything they needed to know. And to them, Monica wasn't a mother seeking fairness. She was a story they'd read, a headline they'd repeated. Mason walked close beside her, his blazer slightly too big, his sneakers clean but worn. He kept his eyes low, his steps small. He was trying not to exist more than necessary. Monica held his hand not tightly, just enough to remind him, "You're not alone, and you don't have to carry this by yourself." The accusations against Mason had spread fast. Black teen attacks, white officer's son, that's what the media called it. They didn't print the part where Mason had stepped in to defend another student, a smaller boy who was being mocked for his accent. They didn't mention that Landon Grayson, the so-called victim, had been the one throwing the first words loud and cruel. But none of that made the news. It didn't fit the story. So now here they were, mother and son, walking into a room where justice was supposed to be blind, but somehow had already made up its mind. Officer Natalie Grayson stood just inside the security checkpoint. Her uniform was pressed, crisp hair pulled back to perfection, eyes sharp and steady. She wasn't supposed to be there. As the mother of the so-called victim, she had no business being on duty. But no one seemed to mind. She stood with the confidence of someone who knew rules didn't apply the same way to everyone. As Monica approached, Grayson raised her eyes slowly, letting them settle on Mason first, then on Monica. "You got paperwork?" she asked casually, too casually. Monica opened her bag wordless. She handed over the forms. The court noticed Mason's birth certificate. Grayson barely glanced at them. "This your boy?" she asked, even though she already knew. Monica nodded. Grayson leaned in, a little voice low enough that it could pass for polite. "He's smaller than I pictured. Guess stories make people bigger." There was a moment. Monica could have said something, could have pushed back, but she didn't. Instead, she looked her straight in the eye just for a beat. And in that stillness, Monica said everything she needed to without uttering a word. Grayson stepped aside. "Good luck in there," she said with something almost like a smile. "You'll need it." Monica led Mason forward. Inside the courtroom, the air was stiff, like the kind of quiet that hums after thunder, but before the lightning reaches the ground. The benches were full, not with family or friends, but with people who came to watch. A story was playing out in real time, and they were here for the spectacle. As Monica and Mason took slow steps down the aisle, the room shifted. Heads turned. Words floated behind them like smoke. "That's her. Is that the boy?" They always come in looking innocent. Monica's jaw tightened. Mason's shoulders dropped. He stared at the floor, already too small for this room, and shrinking more with every step. She reached out, gently placed her hand on his back. Then she sat beside him, arranging papers that didn't need arranging, just to give her fingers something to do. Everything in this room was unfamiliar, unwelcoming. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the sentence had. It lived in the walls, the stairs, the silence that only got deeper when Monica looked up and saw Officer Grayson again, now seated at the back of the room, out of uniform, but just as sharp. Grayson's eyes were fixed on her. Not curious, not nervous, just waiting. Monica looked away, not down, not defeated, just away. She adjusted Mason's collar, then sat straight, both hands resting flat on the table. She didn't speak, because sometimes silence isn't fear. Sometimes it's the only kind of strength they won't see coming. They hadn't even called the case yet when it started. Monica had barely settled into the wooden bench beside her son when Officer Grayson appeared again, this time, walking straight down the center aisle like it was hers. Her uniform was gone, but her presence carried the same sharp edge. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd already decided where everyone belonged in the room and exactly where Monica did not. "Ma'am, this row's for legal guardians only," she said, standing over them like a storm cloud. Her voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'll have to ask you to move." Monica looked up slowly. "I am his mother." Grayson's eyebrows lifted as if that answer were somehow both expected and still offensive. "We've got rules. This seat is for active representation. If you're not an attorney, you need to step back." Monica's hands stayed folded in her lap. "He's 13. And this is a courtroom, Grayson snapped, louder this time. Not a daycare. The room turned. Not all at once, but like a wave. Heads pivoted, eyes narrowed. Some leaned forward, eager for escalation. Others smirked into their sleeves. Monica stood slow and measured. She didn't argue, didn't match the volume, just stood and reached for her coat, moving aside so Mason wouldn't be caught in the shuffle. But as she bent to gather her bag, Grayson stepped in, sharply nudging the bench with her knee, not forceful enough to be called violence, but just hard enough that Monica lost balance and dropped sideways onto the seat. There was a moment, sharp and still, where no one spoke. Just the sound of a bag hitting the floor and the quiet intake of breath from a child who didn't yet understand how fast dignity can be stripped. Monica didn't look up. She straightened her coat. Then, with the most deliberate motion in the room, she reached into her collar and pressed one small button, the soft click of the recorder activating beneath her scarf. Grayson turned and walked back toward her place like nothing had happened. Monica sat back down in the next row just behind Mason. She didn't adjust her posture, didn't sigh. She simply folded her hands again and watched her son. The room buzzed behind her, but she was no longer interested in it. Mason turned around slowly, his eyes searching hers for some kind of explanation. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked scared, confused, and young. He whispered, "Why do they hate you so much?" Monica didn't answer, not right away. She placed a hand over his and held it there. There was warmth in her touch, but also restraint, the kind of stillness a person learns after years of being judged before they're spoken to. She leaned in close enough that only he could hear her. "You don't need to understand their hatred," she said quietly. "You only need to understand yourself." Mason nodded, but she could see it hadn't settled. Not yet. She didn't expect it to. Monica leaned back again, eyes forward, spine straight. There would be no apology, no explanation, no plea for decency from people who had already thrown it away. What happened a moment ago would never be written down in the court transcript. It wouldn't show up in the official record. But her recorder was running now, and so was time ticking, building, documenting everything they thought no one would remember. She sat there in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because they didn't deserve to hear it yet. Let them think she was weak. Let them think she had lost her footing. Because when you wait long enough, even a fall can become a weapon. The judge entered without ceremony. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and began reading the docket like it was just another routine. There was no pause, no acknowledgement of the eyes in the room or the weight of the moment. It was as if this were just a formality and Monica just another name on paper. She sat still, eyes forward, hands resting in her lap. Her scarf shifted slightly as she breathed. Beneath it, the small microphone pinned inside her collar remained active. Every word, every silence, every unchecked moment of bias, it was all being captured now. Officer Grayson was the first to be called. She stood quickly, confidently, and walked to the front with the kind of posture that didn't ask for permission. Her voice was calm at first, controlled. She explained the incident with clinical distance, but it didn't take long for the tone to change. She described Mason not as a student, but as a problem. She called him confrontational, volatile. She used the kind of language that cloaks accusation and policy, careful but cutting. She mentioned patterns of behavior and concerns for safety. But she never once spoke of the racial slur that started the fight. She never mentioned the boy Mason had defended. She didn't need to. The omission said everything. Monica listened. She didn't blink. She didn't fidget. She simply absorbed every word and stored it both in memory and in tape. Then Grayson turned slightly toward the judge and said what the room had been circling. "This isn't just one boy with a bad temper. This is a reflection of what happens when certain communities don't hold their kids accountable. We've seen it before. We'll see it again." The room didn't gasp. No one objected. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and familiar. The judge said nothing. He scribbled a few notes and moved on. Monica's fingers curled slightly in her lap, but her face remained composed. Then the guidance counselor was called. She spoke softly with the air of someone trying to sound neutral. She used phrases like difficulty adapting and struggles with structured environments. She offered no details, no context, just language designed to imply failure without saying anything directly. Monica didn't respond. She wasn't surprised. This was the quiet part of the system, the one that smiles while it excludes. The one that sounds polite while still pointing fingers. Beside her, Mason barely moved. His shoulders were square, but his gaze stayed low. He was trying to stay still to not give them any more to twist. Monica wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him she was proud of him, but she didn't. She stayed steady because the moment demanded stillness more than comfort. The judge called for a short recess. The crowd exhaled. Some stood, some stretched, some leaned over to whisper. As Grayson walked past Monica's bench, she didn't look down, but her voice drifted just enough. She'll crack. They always do. Monica heard it, so did Mason. She didn't react. She adjusted the edge of her scarf with quiet precision. She didn't flinch or look up, just made sure the recorder was still going. She didn't need to crack. She didn't need to speak. They were doing the work for her, with every insult wrapped in procedure, with every assumption left unchallenged, with every silence from the bench. She let them build their own record, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. And sometimes silence is not surrender. It's evidence. The judge returned from recess as if nothing in the room had shifted. He didn't look up when he sat, didn't glance toward Monica or Mason, just straightened a stack of papers and tapped the edge against the bench like tidying something that had never been messy to begin with. The prosecutor stood with a certain kind of ease, not aggressive, not hostile, just confident in a room where confidence always leaned in one direction. She adjusted her blazer and cleared her throat softly as though what she was about to say was just another logistical suggestion. Your Honor, given the nature of the child's behavior and the circumstances surrounding the incident, we recommend a psychological evaluation for the mother. She paused for effect. There are indications that poor supervision and unstable parenting may have contributed to the escalation. No gas followed. No objection rose. The suggestion hung in the air like something already agreed upon. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice, didn't point fingers. She didn't have to. The system had already trained itself to understand what wasn't being said out loud. The judge nodded. No questions. No clarification. He simply looked down, scribbled something onto the file in front of him, and said he would approve the request. There was no one in that room who had asked Monica what she thought. No one had turned to her. No one had even asked her to stand. Beside her, Mason shifted slightly, just a small movement, but Monica felt it like a tremor under her feet. He was trying to stay composed, but his hand trembled against the wooden bench. Monica placed her fingers gently on top of his. She didn't grip. She didn't squeeze. She just reminded him she was still there. She had known it would be like this, but knowing did not make it easier. Grayson remained seated near the front. When the judge gave her a brief nod, she stood. Her movements were practiced now. Her tone carried a smug composure. She didn't look at Monica when she spoke. She looked at the judge, at the audience, at the walls. She raised a threat. What did you expect from someone like her? It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The phrase carried its weight like a hidden blade. It was not just about Mason. It was about Monica, about what she looked like, where she came from, what they believed she represented. The courtroom didn't stir. No outrage, no surprise. It was a quiet kind of violence, the kind that lands with a smile. Monica didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on Grayson the whole time. Not wide with shock, not narrowed in anger. Just steady, deep, unmoving. She had been insulted before. She had been dismissed before. But this moment felt different, not because of what was said, but because of how many people in that room agreed with it just by staying silent. The judge didn't ask for clarification. He didn't rebuke the comment. He moved on to the next item like it had never been spoken. And still Monica said nothing. But inside her, something shifted. Not broken, not bruised, sharpened. She turned her gaze back to the bench. Her face remained composed. But her silence no longer felt like stillness. It felt like gathering, like the pause before thunder, like something unseen beginning to align. She thought of Mason beside her, of how much he had already learned just by sitting in that room, how quickly the world had shown him which voices mattered and which were optional, how clearly the law had drawn the line between what it said and what it meant. She let her fingers rest on the table now, not fidgeting, not clenched, just present, ready. The courtroom continued on as if nothing unusual had happened. Motions passed, statements were recorded. The machinery of procedure hummed steadily forward. But for Monica, the tone of the day had changed. They had written her off, and they had done it in public with confidence, with ease. They believed she was invisible. They believed she was finished, and that was their mistake, because they had just handed her exactly what she needed. Not permission, not sympathy. They had handed her a reason. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, but Monica felt the edges tightening. She could sense the story narrowing, closing around her like a vice. The prosecutor kept her eyes on the files. The judge glanced at the clock more than he did at people. And behind them all, Grayson sat comfortably, like a woman who believed the hardest part was over. From the second row, someone leaned in just enough for their voice to carry. It wasn't loud and it wasn't intended to reach her, but it did. "Where's the kid's father?" The words weren't cruel, they weren't even said with malice, but they stung because they carried the kind of assumption that weighed heavier than insults. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict dressed as curiosity. Monica did not turn around. She didn't try to see who said it. She just let the question land and settle. Then after a moment, her voice cut through the quiet. "He doesn't shout, but when he moves, things don't stay the same." There were no follow-up whispers, no gasps, no shifting in the pews, but something shifted anyway. Monica returned her gaze to the front of the room. Her posture never changed. Her tone had been soft but final. She hadn't said it to defend herself. She had said it because the truth didn't need an audience to exist. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Not to check messages, not to scroll. She unlocked the screen and opened her contacts. Her thumb hovered over one name, Elias. She stared at it for a long moment, not thinking, not planning, just watching the name glow on the screen. A name that meant more than most people in that room would ever understand. She didn't press it. She let the screen go dark again. She wasn't ready. Not because she was afraid of what would happen, but because some moments require patience to be powerful. If she called now, it would be a reaction. She didn't want reaction. She wanted precision. Monica knew exactly what Elias was capable of. And more importantly, she knew how much he trusted her to act when she was ready. There had been a time when she would have called, already would have let the weight fall to someone else. But today was different. Today she had watched the system underestimate her in full view. Today she had let them talk, let them judge, let them decide. And today she had not broken. Mason shifted beside her. He didn't look at her phone, didn't ask what she was thinking. He was quiet in a way that wasn't fear anymore. It was learning. He was watching how to hold space without making noise. Monica reached into her coat pocket, not for her phone this time, but for a folded piece of paper she had written on that morning. It held no defense strategy, no names of witnesses, just one sentence she had written to herself before leaving the house. "Let them see what they think they're seeing." She refolded it and tucked it back into the lining of her coat. The courtroom kept moving. The judge spoke. The prosecutor prepared another file. Everything on the surface looked exactly as it had before, but beneath it something had changed. They had started whispering about her, not with the same certainty as before. Now they were unsure, and that was enough. Because in rooms like this, power shifts not with shouting, but with silence that refuses to sink. There was a lull in the room, one of those quiet stretches where everyone knew the next move might shift something, even if they didn't quite know what. And just as the moment seemed ready to pass, Officer Grayson rose from her seat with a calm that was more calculated than composed, raising her voice just enough to be heard as she addressed the judge with a measured tone, requesting to make a few additional remarks framed as clarification. Although no one in the room seemed confused, the judge, without hesitation or a glance toward Monica, gave her the floor with the kind of indifferent nod that had become routine, and just like that, the space belonged to Grayson once again. She stood at the center like she had earned it, her spine straight, her voice steady, and as she began to speak, her words carried the polished weight of someone used to being heard, used to being trusted, used to defining what truth meant in a room built to record only one version of it. She began softly with language dressed in civility, explaining that in her years working closely with youth from difficult environments, she had seen behaviors, patterns, warning signs. And while she never said Mason's name, every syllable made it clear who she meant and what she thought he represented. Then she paused, not long enough for someone to object, but just enough to prepare her audience for the turn she was about to take. And when she spoke again, the change in tone was so subtle, it felt like a shift in temperature, not volume, as her gaze finally moved toward Monica and settled with intent. "What are you, a politician's girlfriend?" she asked with mock curiosity, as if it were a punchline she didn't expect anyone to laugh at, followed by a sentence that seemed to scrape against the walls of the courtroom. As she continued, "You think you're special, just because you sit here quiet, crossing your legs like you belong." And then came the final strike, not shouted, not even emphasized, but somehow heavier than all the rest, when she said, "You're a nobody, like it was the end of a sentence and the closing of a case. The room went still, not in shock, but in a silence that knew better than to respond. The kind of silence that allows harm to echo just a little longer. And in that stillness, no one turned to Monica. No one stood for her. No one said a word. Monica, however, did not blink, did not shift, did not look away, because in that moment she understood something that Officer Grayson had clearly forgotten. Something that required no correction, no rebuttal, no raised voice, only the strength to remain exactly where she was. She held her gaze steady, her expression unreadable but far from hollow. Because what she gave Grayson in that look was not anger or humiliation, but clarity, the kind that reveals not who you are, but who the other person just revealed themselves to be. What Grayson did not know, could not possibly have known, was that she had just crossed a threshold, one that couldn't be undone or explained away, one that exposed more about herself than about Monica, and all of it happened in front of a room that had grown far too comfortable, watching a woman of dignity be tested for no other reason than that she refused to fold. The judge did not interrupt and the prosecutor remained quiet. The clerk kept her eyes low, and in that silence, Monica's restraint became its own declaration, not a retreat, but a witness. Behind her, someone stirred the kind of shift that happens when shame creeps in too late. But Monica didn't turn around, didn't allow the moment to dissolve into discomfort or pity, because she wasn't there to absorb anyone's guilt. She had come prepared for this. Not for the insult itself, but for what would follow, for what it would expose, for the way it would capture something no transcript could reflect. Grayson sat back down with a look of satisfaction, unaware that what she thought was victory was actually evidence, because in Monica's silence, something had taken shape, something patient, precise, and already in motion. She had said nothing. She had done nothing. But they had seen everything, and that would be enough. The courtroom had not yet recovered from the venom Grayson had just released. Her words still hung in the air unchallenged, as if they belonged there, as if no one in that room had the will to name what they had just witnessed. The judge glanced briefly at his notes. The prosecutor straightened a folder without looking up, and Monica remained still quiet and impossibly composed. Then, without warning, the doors opened. No loud knock, no formal announcement, only the low creak of wood and a breath of cold air that moved through the space like a silent verdict. It wasn't the kind of chill that stung skin, but the kind that settled beneath it, the kind that reminded you of what power feels like when it walks into a room that has grown too used to abusing silence. Every head turned, not because of noise, but because the room had changed. Something unseen had shifted, and it drew the eyes of every person without permission, as if the atmosphere itself had decided to correct its balance. He entered with a stillness that commanded more attention than footsteps ever could. There was no flash of authority on his chest, no introduction called out ahead of him, no need for explanation. He walked like a man who knew the rules and had once written them, like someone who understood that real presence did not require performance. He didn't look left or right. He didn't slow down. He moved with purpose, with calm, with weight. Grayson turned slowly, her expression confused at first, then wary. She didn't know why yet, but her body had already recognized that the rules of the room were shifting beneath her. She leaned slightly toward the prosecutor and spoke in a voice that tried to stay casual, but cracked under its own uncertainty. "Who the hell is that?" She didn't get an answer, because just then the man stopped at the center of the aisle, and his eyes found her with quiet precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The woman you humiliated is my wife." The words didn't echo. They landed. Clean, unshaken, undeniable. Every person in the room froze. The prosecutor lowered her pen. The judge straightened without meaning to. Even the whispering in the back row evaporated like it had never existed. Grayson said nothing, because for the first time that day she had nothing left to say. Her confidence faltered. Her breath hitched. And in the span of a few seconds, the woman who had ruled the room with her smirks and her thinly veiled threats was now small, uncertain, and visibly searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left. Because Elias Fields was not just a man. He was a mirror. And he had arrived not to make noise, but to reflect everything this courtroom had been willing to ignore. He didn't look around for effect. He didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there, rooted in silence, and let the weight of the truth do what years of words never could. And Monica, who had said nothing through it all, who had been stripped and tested and framed, without ever raising her voice, finally lifted her eyes. She met Grayson's gaze without anger, without vengeance, and without fear. There was no victory in her face, only clarity, because she had never needed to prove anything, and now they all knew why. Grayson turned her eyes away first. The judge cleared his throat, but found no words. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequence, full of understanding, full of reckoning. And in that moment, no one in the room doubted who held the most power. Not because he entered loudly, but because when he did, the room finally heard itself for the first time. The silence did not end when Elias spoke. It expanded. It settled into every seat, every breath, every paper resting untouched on the desks of people who had spent the better part of that day pretending not to see what had been unfolding before them. But now there was nothing left to pretend. The truth had walked in and taken its place without permission, and the room was still trying to understand what that meant. Elias didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let the weight of what had just been said hang in the air like a closing argument no one was expecting, but everyone knew had landed where it needed to. Then with a calm that didn't ask for authority, but revealed it, he opened his briefcase and took out a single file. He did not raise it. He did not wave it for the room to see. He simply handed it to the bailiff, who for the first time that day looked unsure of who he was supposed to be taking orders from. The bailiff hesitated for a breath, then took the file and delivered it directly to the bench. The judge looked down at it without touching it, then looked up at Elias as if waiting for him to explain. Elias did not offer explanation. He offered proof. That file contained a full internal report from the Department of Justice, including transcripts, surveillance footage, a summary of prior complaints buried beneath bureaucratic language, and most importantly, audio recorded in that very courtroom from the moment Monica had sat down. The same courtroom that had accused her of being unfit. The same courtroom that had allowed her to be shoved, insulted, humiliated without interruption. The judge opened the file. His face, so practiced in neutrality, could no longer hold its shape. Line by line, image by image, the truth unraveled before him, not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, steady unmasking. There were voices, there were names, there were timelines that didn't match the stories told earlier that day. There was Grayson's voice, clear, undeniable. There were her words wrapped in protocol, but soaked in bias. And there was silence too, the silence of those who had chosen not to intervene. And now that silence was written down. Elias turned toward the center of the courtroom and nodded once toward an officer who had been standing near the back, previously unnoticed. The officer stepped forward this time with no uncertainty and walked directly to Grayson, who rose from her chair in disbelief. She started to speak something between denial and confusion, but her words fell apart in her mouth before they could find structure. The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply informed her that she was being taken into custody, pending formal charges and internal investigation. And before she could ask what charges, the officer read them calmly one after another like bricks, stacking in real time. The room did not erupt. It exhaled, quietly, collectively. And in that breath, justice stopped being a symbol and started becoming an action. The judge stood, slowly, his eyes on Elias, then on Monica, then back down to the file. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The weight in his shoulders was louder than apology, heavier than guilt. It was the realization that he too had been seen. Elias did not look at the judge for long. He walked toward the bench, but stopped halfway. He turned this time, facing the entire courtroom, and when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. Only now it carried something more than power. It carried reckoning. You judged her without listening. Now the country will listen to her silence. And with that, he stepped back, not as a man seeking attention, but as someone who had said what needed to be said and knew that the echoes would now speak for themselves. No one in the room moved to stop him. No one asked a question, because sometimes the most irreversible things arrive not in chaos, but in clarity. And clarity had just arrived. No one moved when Grayson was led out of the courtroom. They had all seen this moment justice began to turn, but they didn't yet know how to breathe in a room that had changed so completely. It wasn't that they were stunned. It was that the silence Monica had carried all morning had become something too sacred to interrupt. Monica stayed seated for a while longer, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that real strength does not rush to take the floor after the noise has faded. Her eyes weren't searching. Her hands didn't fidget. She was waiting, not for approval, not for applause. She was waiting for truth to settle in the room long enough that people could finally recognize its shape. When she rose, no one stood with her, but every gaze followed. She walked to the center of the room, the same space where her son had been judged without being heard, where her motherhood had been questioned without a word from her mouth. She looked at Mason first, and he looked back with a stillness no child should have learned so early, but somehow he carried it now. She gave him a single nod, Then she turned to the courtroom. Her voice did not rise. She did not need it to. I stayed silent so my son would know there's power in dignity. Nothing more. Nothing rehearsed. Just a sentence shaped by every moment she had swallowed, every insult she had absorbed, every second she had chosen not to respond. And because the silence before had been so loud, her words now filled the room without needing to echo. Somewhere near the back, a woman dropped her gaze and wiped her cheek with her sleeve. One of the jurors looked down, clasped his hands, and didn't lift his head again. The prosecutor, who had spoken earlier with cool certainty, now sat as if each word Monica had just said had peeled back something she didn't know was there. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in recognition. There was no gavel, no ruling, no statement from the bench, but justice had already spoken, and it had spoken through the one voice they had tried hardest to ignore. Outside the courthouse it had begun. A video clip only 16 seconds long had already been posted, not by a news crew, but by someone in the crowd. It showed Monica rising, speaking, and sitting back down. No edits, no commentary, just that. And it was spreading faster than any press release ever could. People weren't just reposting it. They were listening to it. They were teaching it. They were asking why it took a woman's silence to expose what years of hearings had buried. That evening, major networks aired segments not about confrontation, but about composure. They showed images of Monica in the hallway sitting beside her son. They played audio from inside the courtroom, the muttered insult, the sighs, the judgment, the stillness. It was no longer about the hearing. It was about the hearing that came after the one happening across the country, in classrooms, in homes and offices, in conversations between parents and children who had always known but had never seen it laid bare with such quiet certainty. Grayson's name was everywhere, but not because she had been arrested, because people were finally counting the number of times someone like her had been believed over someone like Monica. Her past cases were reopened, her citations dissected. Her silence in other rooms with no cameras was no longer excusable. As for Judge Benning, he wasn't removed, not yet. But his rulings, his tone, his absence of presence were all under review. Public petitions called not just for his resignation, but for accountability from the entire system that had allowed this to play out in broad daylight and still hoped no one would notice. But they had noticed, because one woman had said one sentence, and they couldn't stop hearing it. Monica didn't return to that courthouse. She didn't give interviews. She didn't step in front of cameras. She went home with her son the same way she had walked in that morning, without spectacle, without noise, and with the kind of stillness that now carried the weight of thousands who had once felt unseen. That night at the kitchen table, she made him tea and sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing left to explain. And when Mason finally broke the quiet, it wasn't a question. It was a truth. "I heard you, Mom." She looked at him for a long moment. Not surprised, not relieved, just full. "I know," and that was all. Because some stories don't end with a verdict. They end with a child understanding what dignity looks like when it stands still and lets the world catch up. There was no declaration from the judge, no sudden shift in volume, no official end to the hearing. Yet every person in that courtroom knew something had reached its conclusion. What had finished was not a trial, but a way of looking at someone like Monica and expecting her to fold. What ended was the assumption that dignity would always wait quietly in the back row. Monica stood without a hurry. Her movements were as calm and measured as they had been all day. She did not look for anyone's reaction. She didn't offer any final glance. She simply rose with her son and her husband and began walking the narrow path between rows of people who had only hours earlier barely noticed her. Now they stepped aside. They did not move in panic or embarrassment. They made space with quiet instinct, the way people do when they witness something that feels more significant than the setting it occurred in. There was no noise, only the shuffle of feet and the deepening hush that wrapped around her like respect too long delayed. As she passed through the crowd outside, no one reached for a microphone. No camera blocked her path. For a moment, the city held its breath. Monica moved forward, her posture unbroken, her presence more commanding in silence than most ever managed in speech. Near the back of the crowd, a woman turned to the man beside her. She did not raise her voice. She only whispered as if repeating something that might disappear if said too loudly. She didn't just survive this. She rewrote what justice looks like. Monica heard none of it. She did not need to. Her silence had already done its work. It had cracked something open that could not be sealed again. She stepped into the car without a word. Mason followed her, holding his own silence like something earned. Elias closed the door gently, then walked to the other side. By the time the car pulled away, the video had already begun to circulate. It was not sensational. No one was shouting. No one was being pulled apart. It was only Monica standing, offering one sentence, then walking away with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through the entire day. I stayed silent so my son would know there is power in dignity. The internet reacted with something rare. It did not shout back. It listened. Clips of that moment were shared across platforms, not as protest, but as reminder. Teachers replayed it in classrooms. Commentators paused over it in podcasts. Parents showed it to their children, not as an example of strategy, but of strength. What had happened in that courtroom was no longer just about misconduct or the exposure of a flawed system. It had become something more difficult to measure and more lasting to carry. It had become a mirror, and people were seeing themselves inside it. Officer Grayson's name began appearing in internal review reports. Her history was no longer quiet. Judge Benning's decisions were revisited in the light of national scrutiny. He remained in his seat, but the shadow that followed him now stretched longer with every ruling. Monica, however, remained absent from the headlines. She gave no interviews. She signed no deals. She did not become a celebrity. She returned to her home, to her son, to the small routines that had always given her strength long before the world knew her name. That evening, she made tea without ceremony. She folded a blanket at the edge of the couch. And when Mason sat beside her, there was no dramatic conversation, no long debriefing of what had passed. He simply looked at her with eyes now clearer shaped, not by what she had said, but by what she had endured. "I heard you, Mom." She turned toward him. Her face held nothing theatrical, only the steady truth of someone who had carried a fire without letting it burn her voice. "I know." Nothing more needed to be said, because the loudest stories are not always the ones filled with sound. Sometimes they are the ones that choose stillness over spectacle. Sometimes they are the ones that ask nothing but leave something lasting in return. As Monica closed her eyes that night, the world kept spinning, still noisy, still uncertain. But somewhere in that movement, there was now a pause that had not existed before, and it was shaped like her silence. Thank you for staying with us through this story. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a loud voice or a raised fist. Sometimes it walks into the room, quietly sits down, and simply refuses to disappear. Monica didn't win by shouting. She won by standing still, by holding her dignity when the world expected her to fall apart. And in doing so, she reminded us that silence, when it carries truth, can echo louder than any verdict. If this story moved you, if it made you think or reminded you of someone, we ask you to take one small step like this, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where voices like Monica's are honored, remembered, and passed on. Your support doesn't just help this channel grow. It gives our creative team the strength to keep telling stories that matter, stories that speak softly but stay with you long after they're told. This is more than just a story. This is a reminder that quiet courage still changes the world.